for your flattering introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here. It's sort of like coming home when you go to another open university, because we're all spawned by the British Open University, and it's interesting how we have the same model, but how we've had to adopt it to different conditions. And so I'm going to, well, I'll show you what I'm going to do. I have my traditional opening joke, followed by talking about the need for distance education research and the sorry state of our research. And then I'm going to talk about the major paradigm models for doing research, sort of putting them down in various ways and as straw dogs, and then presenting design-based research as a better alternative, and then just talking about how we can do a better job of disseminating and building a research culture. And I'm also just going to talk a little bit about I think it's a very interesting comparison between Athabasca University and the Israeli Open University, in the sense that if you look at most of the open universities around the world, they're huge, at least by Athabasca and by Israeli standards. And I think we're probably very compatible in our model and in our size. So let me start by asking, we've done a lot of, we've had huge growth in distance education at our institution, and I know you have as well. And so we had to do a little research finding out why there was such a drastic increase. And the results of that research are as follows, that it's better, distance education is better than sex, because if you get tired, you can stop and save your place and pick up where you left off. If you finish early, you can do it without feeling guilty. And you can get rid of any viruses you catch with a $50 program from McAfee. And with a little coffee, you can do it all night long. And you usually don't get divorced if your spouse interrupts you in the middle of it. And finally, if you're not sure what you're doing, you can always ask your tutor. So that's such growth. Okay, just a real brief introduction to Athabasca. It's located way over here in the northwest part of the province. It's a funny thing, because it was founded in the city where I live now of 1 million people in Edmonton, but then it was relocated 160 kilometers north up into the bush to create jobs in the hinterland, basically as a political decision. So it's always a long drive up there, and most of the faculty refuse to move up there. So it's a strange kind of an environment for a university. But it has had a lot of growth, about 34,000 students. Again, open universities are terrible for the way they count. You count them after they drop out, when they drop out, and all those things. But so you take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But we have about 55,000 separate enrollments of 34,000 students. Graduate and undergraduate, the largest Master of Distance Education program, I think, in the world, with 350 students. And we spent a lot of time getting regionally accredited by one of the accrediting boards in the United States. This is a little picture of it. This is the campus down here. And you might think that right here, that this is a suburb of Athabasca, but that actually is Athabasca. It's 3,000 people, and a lot of bush all the way around it. I did a quick comparison. You'll notice that over here, that how the year we were founded was within 1 year of each other. The biggest difference is the population. The province where Athabasca is in is 3.2 million, 32 million in Canada. Less than half of our students are in Alberta. Mostly they're all spread across Canada and Israel. I guess this is the biggest difference geographically. But the similarities are we both have a full arts and science type program, big business programs, big psychology programs. We both have MBAs, Master of Science, MBE, Master of Distance Ed, that sort of thing. I think one of the only differences, and what maybe makes Athabasca a little bit different about a lot of universities, open universities, is that we have continuous enrollment. So you can start anytime you want and stop when you want. And that makes it very convenient for students, and it allows students who, if their dog died or whatever from another university, that we transfer a lot of credits back and forth between our university. but it makes it very, very difficult for getting collaborative learning happening, because even if they don't start at the same time, some want to finish in 2 months and some in 2 years, and trying to work that out is the challenge that I'll talk about later. You can see the growth patterns are very similar over the years. And we have about 105 or 10 full-time academics, and then a lot of tutors like you have, so it's very similar. But I'm going to talk about distance education research, and I was at a panel at the International Council of Distance Ed in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and somebody put their hand up and said, well, can you name one distance education research that's really made a difference? And I couldn't think of anything. And so let me challenge you with the same question and talk to your neighbor for just a minute and think about, is there any distance education research that's really changed things or made a difference in your practice as a distance educator? And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to talk to your neighbor about that. Don't be shy, you can turn around.
שרה, תגידי, היי, תגידי משהו, שרה. גם אני לא. הייתי בהרבה כאן, והם לא מכירים מחקרים שעשו את זה.
זה ממש נכון, שרוב הפרויקטים של דיסטנס אדיוקיישן,
Well, I guess the difference is what you define as making an improvement, I guess.
Can you name the research that had made a difference in education?
Well, maybe education, maybe administration, maybe...
I mean, just to get an idea, what do you refer as?
I guess I would leave it open, and I guess the point of the question is to suggest that maybe there's very little difference that has been made by research in any domain, but maybe...
Well, you may look for differences on empirical level, and you may end up with no results. However, if you're looking for a difference on the conceptual level, maybe there is more to say here.
Okay.
Because I think we should look at differences on more conceptual level than empirical level.
Okay.
It may us think differently about education.
And thinking different without acting about it is all right?
It is the first stage. It's
Yeah.
a must first stage.
Yeah, an important first stage, for sure. Okay, well, you can ask yourself if there has been something that's been important conceptually or empirically or on the ground. Why was that research make a difference? Because it was a good question that they addressed, because the context related directly to your practice, because it used methodology, because of clarity, who knows. But if you think of typical distance education research, and when we go to the Canadian Distance Education Association, it's a little embarrassing because there's a lot of dedicated people there who are really trying hard. But typically, probably over half of them, the presentation is, here's what we're doing, isn't it wonderful? You know, and that's where it ends. We don't get much beyond for transference or theoretical background. The other thing that I get asked a lot is, why don't you come and do research here, because I'm doing such wonderful things. And I know most of us have real jobs and have other interests besides that. So there's a lot of variability by journal, by conference, by region, by practice. So what is research? Defining it, the systematic study. And if you look at the adjectives here, it's disciplined, it's transparent, it's public, it's scientific, it's diligent, it's accessible, organized, problem-oriented. You see that it can be fairly intimidating for a lot of people, because good research is not easy, and it takes a lot of time and energy. And I think in distance education, as well as all forms of education, we're often more challenged with the day-to-day teaching requirements than the research requirements. And I think that somehow we have to develop a research culture that will allow us to do both better. And that's what I think, what I make the argument that the design research does. So you can ask, well, why should we do? I mean, I think anybody who's in distance education knows that there's many more questions than there are answers. But if you think of just the problems in traditional education, like attrition, like the value of face-to-face tutorials, like paced versus unpaced, there's a whole bunch of unresolved issues there. And then when we start talking about the new media, collaborative learning at a distance, we talk, the group-based learning in particular, it's really inconvenient for teachers, for students, but some people, for some disciplines, at some times, it's probably critical. but is it critical all the time? And can you have an audio or a video conference that gives you that real-time interaction without meeting face-to-face? And what courses, at what level, and for what students, what learning styles? It can go on and on and on. And how much money should you spend on multimedia compared to just having text-based material, which is, of course, much cheaper to produce. And then we're getting into the new, and my talk on Wednesday, I'm going to talk about Web 2.0 and social software tools. What's their place in distance education? And I think they have almost revolutionary impact on both paced and unpaced forms of distributed education. And the problem is that, as Rodney Dangerfield, the American comedian, used to say, that you just don't get no respect. And that's, I think, our problem in educational research, is that most research is not valued by funders, by funding bodies, by other academics, and often by distance education practitioners themselves. They can't answer the question, what has made a difference from the research that you're doing. And if you look at it from a financial perspective, these are Canadian figures, and I really don't know how they would match with Israeli figures, but in education in Canada, we spend 0.01% of the money we spend on education, we spend on educational research. And in health, we have a goal in Canada of spending 3%, so that's 300 times as much per dollar invested in the enterprise. And of course, high-tech companies, they spend much higher, 10 to 15% of their total expenditures are on research and development. And overall in Canada, it's 1.88%. So you can see how underfunded the research establishment is in the education business. And if you look at the professionals who have evaluated distance education research, this is Jedediah, when he was in Hong Kong, he did a big study for ICDE, and he found that the experimental research projects did not display rigor in their design. I'll get into that later. In generalizing inappropriately, few concerned with teacher and tutor support, and lots of them lack a strong theoretical base. And I like this quote from Dutch scholar Van de Ecker, who says that from the perspective of the practitioner, the answers are too narrow to be meaningful, too superficial to be instrumental, too artificial to be relevant, and on top of that, they usually come too late. So put all of those things together, and it sounds like trouble. Okay, what are the barriers? It's nobody's job. I wonder how many people who, at their job at their institution, here or at others, over 50% of their time is that they do research. How many? Put your hand up if you're in that ballpark. Okay, so we have about 4 or 5 people, and these are the people who actually come to a lecture on research. So I'm thrilled that there's actually that many. But you know, if we were in medical research or something like that at a research university, you know, half the hands would go up. And, so anyways, the whining is going to end in a while, but negligible industry support, you know, you think of, at least when we fill out grant applications these days, they're always saying, well, what's the commercial possibilities, and who are your investors, and where are they, and in medicine and in engineering, they actually exist, you know, but in education, it's very challenging to find people. No, where's the money on the Human Genome Project or get to the moon or something? Where's the big question and the big bucks to try to resolve it? And how do you keep score in a meaningful term on what production really matters? And again, as I said, the trust in the efficacy. In the sum, we have a lack of an effective research culture. And then I'm just going to end this section by just asking about who should do research. Action research, I think, is wonderful. I think it's a great way for people who are in the trenches, who are actually practicing, to try to reflect, to actually gather data. The biggest problem with it is that teachers usually are too busy to be researchers and teachers, or to do a good job of doing both. But it induces reflection and ends with dissemination. Students as researchers, I think they're a great resource, and I think we have a bigger challenge, at least in distance education, where we don't see our graduate students very much, if at all, and trying to make that relationship into a productive partnership. And professional researchers, you know, who should they be? Should they be just people in the Chase Center, or just people who are full-time professionals, or can people who don't have a grounding in the education field, should they be full-time or part-time researchers, or how can we help them to start to learn how to be researchers in this area? All in all, how do we build a research culture? And I'm just going to quickly go through the four major paradigms that I've been able to isolate anyways, from the quantitative to the qualitative to a critical perspective, and with the design-based alternative, and give you a couple examples from Athabasca. The quantitative paradigm, at least in the States, for education, is on a real upward trend. The U.S. government is targeting moving from 12% to, I think it was 78% of their research funding to go on control group studies, preferably blind control group studies, following the medical model, saying that if it's real, and they want to find out what works. They have the What Works site that you can go to on the website. And so they're really throwing a lot of money at saying that the reason we're not getting anywhere is because we haven't had rigorous scientific research the same way they do in medicine and others. And I really have problems with that kind of, not that well, whenever one has one exclusive way to truth, it ends up causing as many problems as it resolves. The quantitative paradigm has a long tradition born from the natural sciences, of course. But the big problem is context in education, is that there are so many variables, and a good scientific study with the quantitative paradigm controls or acknowledges all of the variables. And when you get to variables such as, I wasn't feeling good today, my dog just died, the weather is bad, the textbook was not there, I mean, it goes on and on and on, the many variables, and it's such a almost impossible task to control them all. But as I say, a long tradition of positivism, those who are seeking the strict way of truth should not trouble themselves with any object which they cannot very accurately measure. And you know that some of the most important things about cognition, about affect and learning, some of the big questions do not meet this criteria. So attempting to use quantitative methodologies alone to resolve these problems, I think it's not going to give us the results that we want, despite the amount of money the Americans are throwing at it. As I say, control group assignment is rarely possible. Blind assessment, not practical. The contextual variables, what works in one context doesn't guarantee that it'll work in another. And interventions are never controlled, nor are they identical. So what you do traditionally, because these small quantitative studies, the traditional, or one of the ways to control the variation is to combine studies together in a meta-analysis and try to find if there's significant variations or significant things that are happening with larger populations by bringing them together. And I'll just show you a recent, 2003 study that was done in Canada, and it was a systematic review of, and the questions were, is internet-based education better than face-to-face education? Broad question like that. And but what was amazing is that the only criteria was that they had to use technology and they had to have a control group. And of course, that since most studies in distance education do not use control groups, they threw away 80 or 90% of the studies to begin with, because that can't work within this methodology. But the biggest problem with this particular study is they were comparing full graduate level courses that were online with students in grade 4 who had a web safari, because they both had control groups and they both had they used technology. And then they, of course, whenever you do meta-analysis, you always have the compulsory whine about how the studies are no good and there isn't enough of them. But what do these studies come out with? And this is consistent in education. No significant difference, because when you combine the little variations over on this side with the positive ones here, the negative ones there, you come up with nothing, basically. There are too many extraneous variables that are swamping out the intervention variable that you're trying to study. And under satisfaction, though, they were noted that students were more favorable to traditional than to network learning. And again, anybody who's been into distance education for a long time, it really depends whether a person is more satisfied with distance education, what their context is, what's important to them. If they're working and they have kids at home, they're going to like distance education because just because of the conditions that they're living in. So again, we don't really learn a lot even when we combine them together. So this is from the What Works site in the States, and they talk about and only to be strong evidence, it must have randomized controlled studies, and they must be typical school studies, and then you get strong evidence. And I suggest that there's very little educational knowledge that has been gained or will be gained using that kind of a methodology alone. So to sum up, it can be useful, especially when testing well-established and consistent practice. But in times of rapid change, like we're in right now, sometimes we'll have a very good intervention, but because of all these other contextual variables, we won't be able to isolate a significant difference from it, and that can cause us to throw the intervention out before we've really studied it well. Okay, moving now to qualitative paradigm. Many different varieties, phenomenology to just, it seems to be a habit of people in qualitative study to develop a new method, give it a new name, and move on without thinking about the other people very much. Generally answers the question why rather than what or how much. It's a special challenge to distance ed because of distance. We don't really see our students, and observations of our students is especially challenging. Nonetheless, it is currently the most common type of distance education research. And let me just give real quick two examples. This is an English study, student support in open learning with practicing nurses who had a weekly face-to-face tutorial phenomenological study using grounded theory. And here's the results. They showed that life events were driving the process. They went through initiating, awakening, changing their personal practice, becoming professionals, and sustaining the process, the context of learning and development. And I believe that this is all true, but so what? Didn't they know that beforehand? These are things that professionals have been studying for a long time. And they also conclude that support structures to facilitate personal and professional development within this context need to be in place, and attention must be given to the provision of effective learner support. I mean, we knew that in 1971. A second one, this is just very recent from the European research on open and distance learning, looking at people's experience with a learning management system, Blackboard here, and they found that there were 4 different ways of perceiving online learning. Some felt it was the practical experience, some were looking at interconnections, some expressing thoughts, and one thought it was great for flexible learning. Again, I think I knew that before this study was started, that people value those things, and some people value more or less than the others. So maybe I'm doing a short shift of qualitative summaries because I think there is a place for understanding the students and the teachers' perspectives. But we really have to press and make sure that it's going to be a valuable result when we ask the question. And the other, in order to validate if this qualitative study is any good, Burkhardt and Schoenfeld say the critical appraisal concerning plausibility. Again, who is the critical evaluator? Is it the students? Is it the teachers? Is it the administrators? Or is it the researchers? And sometimes we all have different perspectives on it, and it's very hard to get that kind of fit to prevailing wisdom. It depends whose wisdom we're talking about. And again, too much, we get the answer is it depends. Okay, I'm just going to have one quick example. A colleague of mine, Norm Friesen, he loves to do critical analysis, and generally he starts out with the premise that the U.S. Army is behind all the terrible things in the world, and if he studies hard enough, he will determine the truth of it. And this is a recent paper that he did, and he talked about, somehow about how students' use of computers was somehow manipulative or something, but show how the actual experience of computer use casts into doubt the educational efficacy of computers understood as instruments of cognitive application or simply mind tools. Well, I remember when I read David Jonason's book on mind tools 10 years ago, I was quite blown away, and I'm still convinced that computers are are great mind tools, but Norm found a hole in the philosophy, and he's finding the critical truth. And his final conclusion, the third one there, user knowledge of the system appears as embodied, performative, and emphatically provisional in nature. I really don't have any idea what that means, but that's what Norm concluded. So I'm going to ask the question, do these research paradigms meet the real needs of practicing distance educators? One interesting study from Australia in 1999, where they had a bunch of teachers actually read studies. And they asked them, which one of these really make a difference to you, or speak to you, or are going to really help you? And they found that the teachers aren't consistent. It's a complex world. Some people like this, some people like that. They did like the ones that were talking about studies between teaching and learning, which was great, and I'm glad to hear that. They are teachers. But this is the ending quotation. The findings from this study cast doubt on virtually every argument for the superiority of any particular research genre, whether the criteria for superiority is pervasiveness, relevance, or ability to influence. So I don't think that there is one single mode, and even design-based research, which I'll now get into, I think does some ability to combine them. But it certainly is a challenge that we're up with, mostly because I believe we're importing research paradigms from other disciplines in other contexts where they were developed to be most effective. But that doesn't mean we don't like to fight about it. And I love this quote, in any dispute, the intensity of feeling is inversely proportional to the value of the stakes at hand. And this is why academic politics are so bitter. Okay, getting to design-based. What is it? It's related to engineering and architectural research. It focuses on the design, the construction, the implementation, and the adoption of a learning initiative. It basically says right at the beginning that we can do education better. And we can't just sit and talk about it or think about it. We have to intervene. We have to do something and try to learn from our intervention in a context, a real context. It is related to the, if you look in the literature, the term was officially coined by Anne Brown, I think in 1998, an American researcher, but a few people in Holland were talking about developmental research a few years earlier, which is roughly the same thing. It is the closest educators have to a homegrown research methodology. And as I mentioned, it's interventionist. And it's very related to action research. For those who are familiar, I often say it's action research on steroids. It's done better. I've heard it's related, but I'll try to show the differences. Again, the contextual turn, the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the context is so important and so changing in education, and they cannot be isolated and reduced in a meaningful way. Also, the postmodern assertions of variability make it so that, again, a particular answer is unlikely in every context. This is from De Figaro, who's a Spanish scholar, like this stuff, but he talks about how the context actually creates the content, and the content creates the context. And if you ever separate one of those from the other, you will end up getting led astray. So you can't forget context ever. And then finally, what I've just been catching up on complexity research that I really hadn't followed since it was first really talked about in the early to mid-90s. And now it's coming. There's actually this conference in Vancouver on right last week, which was on complexity research in education. And I think that there's a lot of broad stroke kind of stuff that we can apply. And basically, it suggests that in complex environments, we are not going to get predictable behaviors. We're going to get generalizations. We're going to get ways to help things move along, but we're not going to get prescriptive recipes. And the fact that interventions from the outside, like teacher or researcher interventions, are conditioned, and they're recursively amplified or extinguished by what's happening in the environment at that time. And the hope is that the emergent behaviors of organisms from a natural perspective, a biological perspective, we can see that happening in our institutions. And that's why I'm going to make the argument on Wednesday for social software. We should be using blogs and wikis and all these things, mostly because our institution needs that variability and that testing environment. Without it, we can very easily coalesce into models that don't move forward. And we have to learn to work at the edge of chaos, as complexity leaders say, not in a totally chaotic world where we understand nothing, but not in a bureaucratic, standardized world either. And there's lots of good writing that's coming out. Again, as I said, it's certainly not unique to education, but educators are talking more and more about complexity theory these days. So you have the context, you have the design intervention, whatever it is, and then just one slide to talk about evaluation and assessment. It's so big in education. It just seems to, I mean, thank God there is evaluation and assessment and credentialing, otherwise students maybe wouldn't come to us in the first place. But it seems to be pushing us all the time and pushing students and pushing their behavior. So I hope you can read this. This is done by Brenda Bain and Ritland from the States. And it basically is what I think is the best explanation of what a design-based research is. And she talks about it in 4 phases. The first one is informed exploration. And this is one difference between action research, is that mostly practitioners who are doing an action research project don't have the time or energy or the background to really do an informed exploration of both of the context within which the intervention is going to be placed, as well as the background, the literature review. And so they talk about, doing a needs analysis, survey literature, theory development, the kind of things that we all know we should do when we're doing research and oftentimes don't get done. We talk about qualitative interviews with participants, quantitative surveys of experts, focus groups. We look at benchmarking of competitors, needs assessment, role models, persons. So you can see there's some quantitative stuff and some qualitative stuff, and this is before you really do anything. You're usually motivated by an ideal or a vision or something that you think will make a positive intervention, but you don't just jump in and start doing it. You spend a number of months usually in a preliminary study or trying to really make sure that your theoretically and your practitioners are on side. Design-based research is almost always a partnership between practitioners and researchers, not one working without the other. Then you have an enactment stage where you actually do something. You build a software tool, you design a new pedagogy or a new learning activity. You study the process of building your intervention so that other people can learn from it. If you spend 6 months developing a software package, you should be able, at the end of a design-based research, to talk about the process of construction. What did you learn? What did you change? And not just see that it came out as a shrink-wrap product. We try to learn and share that learning around. Then you evaluate it in some kind of a context using both quantitative and qualitative methods. Formative evaluation. Again, the random control studies could happen at this stage. We do expert panel reviews, journaling, videotape logs, all the sorts of, how is this thing working? Why is it working, or why is it not working in this local impact or this local context with which it was first designed? But again, this is just one context, and if it's going to have value to all of us in education or to more than one, we have to see how that intervention works in multiple contexts. So we have to look at combining and talking about what the difference is, reflecting on why it worked here and didn't work over here, again using a variety of methodologies. So that's the big picture of how a good design-based study works. You can see that one of the problems with design-based is that it doesn't fit into somebody who wants to do a master's degree project and be done in 6 months. Because by the time you do all these things, well, especially the 4th phase, it could be multiple years. So that puts a bigger challenge on the researchers to have a research agenda. Others have written about adjectives to describe a design-based research study. It's iterative, you never finished once, process rather than product. It's interventionist, collaborative between administrators, teachers, researchers, all that, and students. Multi-level, utility-orientated, practical. Its philosophical base comes from John Dewey and a lot of the pragmatists, American pragmatists, real hands-on-the-ground kind of people. And what's different, too, between action research is it's both theory-driven and it generates theory, and especially in the 4th phase. So I'll give you two quick examples. We use at Athabasca, we started out with the tutor model, which again is, I think, probably what you use here, and was developed at the British Open University, where our tutors are on call 2 hours a week on the telephone, and they will respond to email within 48 hours. They're part-time. The problem with them, they're the primary and often the only contact with the institution, and the problem is getting them so that they're aware of what's happening within the institution, when the exams are due, and all the administration things that students are concerned about, is that oftentimes the tutors are not conversant with the kind of administrative knowledge that the students need. And professional development and keeping them up to base with the culture and the rules and regulations of the institution is a challenge. But they can and they may establish a personal relationship with students, and this is the variable that causes us all the trouble. They do have subject matter expertise and they have a personal knowledge base, but they often don't have an institutional knowledge base of much size. So we decided to switch to a call center model where a student would not be assigned to a particular tutor. So bang, no personal relationship. But what would happen is that now 40 hours a week, every evening of the week, there was somebody who could answer their question. And we have an extensive system that has frequently asked questions. It's always growing, and the tutors have, or not the call center attendants have all of the curriculum of all of the courses in that department in front of them. They can look up page this or that, or they can answer all of the administrative, technical type questions. They're not subject matter experts, though. So we have a computer tracked customization or tracking service that if they have an academic question, then within 48 hours, an academic tutor will phone them back with that answer. So they sort of get that, but there's a filter that filters out the normal, ordinary type questions. Okay, so when we first started this about 8 years ago now, we moved from this model over here of the individual tutor to the call center model, and we found by serious tracking of the questions that the call center attendants were able to answer 80% of the questions, which was a surprise to all of us, that so many of the questions could be answered by non-academic or people with no subject matter expertise. And we saved over $100,000 a year. And again, you can start to see what's happening here too is that the politics here are coming in. These are academic people with a strong union. These are less well-trained. And so we start bumping up into questions of ideology about what is the university about and who should we be employing and all those sorts of questions. So what did we do from a design-based perspective? We did the literature review, theoretical extrapolation of expert and participant input. We had an ideal and a vision, and that was to reduce cost and increase service. Our vision, our ideal, was not, in this instance, to expand academic influence, so that's where the tension came, as what was our ideal, but it was on student services. And as an open university, we felt good that we could argue that, although our academics always didn't agree. Review of the call center literature, interview with current tutors and managers to see what the process actually was, data collection on the current processes and the cost. We visited other call centers, and these are mostly industry ones, the people who are doing computer support or that sort of thing. And then we did the enactment, production phase. We coded it all ourselves using Lotus Notes. Design and construction. Design should be widely circulated and critiqued. We kept track of the cost of the project, data collection on development problems and costs. We pilot tested it, multiple iterations in the pilot phase before it went live. And then we did it in our undergraduate school of business, and we did formative evaluation interviews, focus groups with call center staff, student satisfaction surveys. Interestingly enough, we did not get significant differences. We had a slight difference, and we continued to study these, of which do the students like better. And when a slight increase, not significant, in favor of the tutor model as opposed to the call center model. I think the personal relationship is really important for some students, but for most students, they couldn't care less. But that's, I think, where the variable is coming from. student interviews, looking at the transaction logs that were stored by the system, the frequently asked questions, and the cost analysis. And then we had interviews with tutors and with the tutors union about what they thought about it. They were not pleased. And again, in the broader impact evaluation, what we generate and advance a particular set of theoretical constructs. We've written, I think, about 4 or 5 papers by a number of authors on this intervention, and we've also now had it to trying to develop a, now we're getting into the point of trying to talk about institutional change. Why have our 2 biggest schools gone to this model, but the rest of the university has not gone and still has the tutor model, and what does it say about change in the university and things like that. So now we have 4 help desks operating at Athabasca, no significant differences. And what we're doing too is moving even beyond call centers to from tutors. Most students, they want their questions answered on the web. They don't want to phone anybody, even if they have all the answers. So again, we're using the call center logs to generate web-based resources for them, which again is a cost savings for us. Okay, I'm just going to end by talking briefly about a second design-based study, which is very much a work in progress that I've been working on. And it's looking at social software and basically asks the questions of what type of interaction meets students' needs, is cost-effective, and is least restrictive on freedom of both student learners and teachers. And I've been testing this in the most convenient way, which is in my courses that I teach and in a couple of other grad courses, which are paced courses. They start in September and January. But what I'm really thinking the answer, or what this should work best at, though I haven't tested it yet, is in a continuous enrollment environment. And that's where I get the freedom of both learners and students. I think we're entering an era where students are going to demand more and more control over how and why and when they learn. And that's what an open university course has always been all about. But we've always had this for testing purposes, for security, for whatever reasons, for convenience of staff. We've had this idea that you always have to start at the same time and end at the same time. And I'm hoping that this kind of study will allow us to have our cake and eat it too, to allow social interactions without confining people to paced environments. So the first stage, review the literature on interaction, self-directed study. We phoned people around the world who were doing distance education, of course, but whether they were doing paced models or unpaced models, and asked them why they were doing which. And we talked about our own faculty and their own experience with social interventions. We've built a lot of websites with a lot of threaded discussions, which nobody was using. And it was partly because they weren't all starting at the same time, and they had no idea whether somebody was answering the question or would answer the question, and getting critical mass on these sites was really challenging. We did a survey of students in classes, asking them about what kind of social interventions they were most interested, and I published a paper on that first stage of it in 2005. And basically the theory that this is coming from is, this is work from European, I can't remember the name. Anyways, they talk about the type I information technologies, which is our correspondent model or our teleconference kind of, or telecourse type model, versus the collaborative distance education, the blended kind of stuff where we're pacing and we're having lots of threaded or synchronous or asynchronous discussion. And this is how we have our undergraduate program is over here, and our graduate programs have a lot of collaborative learning models built into them. But what we're trying to do is develop a type S model, something that's in between that allows us to merge those two together. And again, pick up on learning freedom. Morton Paulson, way back in 1993, talked about the value of freedom of space and the freedom of space, freedom of time. We've done that in distance education since day one. The PACE one, in most institutions are still paced. The freedom of media to allow students to study in different media. Freedom of content, we've been very bad at that. We mostly had prescribed content. And freedom of access, and I added a fifth or a seventh one, which is the freedom of relationship, allowing students the capacity to form collaborative relationships if they want to, but not to want if they want to as well. So all these freedoms are great, But a lot of the collaborative models that we're using now really compromise that freedom. And what we're trying to see is whether social-paced collaborative learning is of significant value such that it justifies those restrictions. And I wrote another little bit making definitions about what social software should be all about from an educational perspective. But won't bore you with those. So where we're at, stage 1 research questions: what tools, learning activities, and incentives allow learners in learner-paced continuous enrollment studies to provide social, cognitive, and teaching presence to each other? And the first survey we did, we found that 78% of the students said that they were interested in interacting with other students as long as they were able to keep their own pacing. They were not willing to give that up. And that might not be the same case in your institution, but this is a self-selected audience. They have chosen self-paced study. And 95% of them said they wanted to look at the work of others. And we see that on Turnitin and some of the by an essay kind of sites. It's no surprise they want to look at what other students are doing. And they talk about the preferred mode of instruction is asynchronous or maybe blending, but again, our students are not all that wild about synchronous activity alone anyways. So we did interviews and surveys, we reviewed the interaction literature, we looked at the different tools, and we developed our research questions and methodology. Now we're in the enactment and where we're building the software. We selected and installed an instance of ELGG, which is a social software suite developed at the University of Edinburgh, open source software. Developed some support strategies and documentation to help students to use it. Pilot testing with faculty, undergraduate and graduate testing. And we had to develop new instructional designs for how do you use these how do you use a blogging environment in an unpaced learning environment. So we basically took the collaborative learning literature and learning activities and we translated them into the tools that were available in the ELGG software. What does it look like? Oh, typically social software, wikis, blogs, events, tracks, polling, user profiles so that students can find each other. Like for us, it has been impossible if there was another student who was studying the same course in the same apartment building as you are, because of freedom of information and privacy laws, it was impossible for us to tell another student that there was another student in their same apartment. And so, but I've been arguing that we don't have the right to deny them the capacity to share that information if they choose to. So this is the software, I call it Me to You, as in meet you or me to you. And it gives a blogging kind of environment and a number of profiling and various other tools. And then the course I teach, with the students develop learning objects which are portals on particular emerging technologies that they then, with the target audience of other students. We use Moodle as for content administration and asynchronous interaction. We force them into a blogging environment. I don't allow them to do a lot of threaded discussion like we used to use. I'm trying to force people into a blogging environment and then test the result. We use a real-time environment, a web conferencing tool called Illuminate, and we use a social bookmarking tool to allow them to share information with a concept mapping tool to design their project collaboratively. So we had to get ethics clearance and resolving some of the privacy issues to evaluate it, focus groups with developers and faculty, student satisfaction surveys, student interviews, and looking at how many people are actually using this software and for what, and trying to maintain awareness of the costs and looking at also a completion rate. And just a real pilot, from last fall, a huge whopping N of 9 here. But we talked about which of these tools was most useful, and I asked them for 8 different educational, from learning content to keeping in touch to socialization, and this is just the combined tool. I'll give more detail this in another one of these talks. But you can see the web conferencing, the real-time stuff seemed to be the most popular. Blogs doing well as well. Email, it's funny how email used to be so pervasive, and I think it's going down now in regard to the other tools that are around and the overflow in all of our email boxes. Yeah, the master's degree, and it's a master's of distance education in education technology. So I can get away with a lot more of forcing them to do things because I think, well, it's a good learning experience for you, even if you're confused. But you might not get away with that in an undergraduate program.
Do you have a chat environment or something like that?
There's real-time audio that's open, like a room that they can go into anytime, 24 hours a day, that they could say, I'll meet you here. And I don't think that our students are as much interested in the text chat anymore. I think it's almost come and gone, although, I don't know. I guess I'd be interested to hear if anybody else has had experience. I did, when we used to use WebCT until a couple of years ago, it had a chat environment built in, and it was never used very much by my students anyway. And again, the real-time synchronous stuff seemed to help them feel connected. But again, that bound them in time. It was every Tuesday night kind of thing. So. Mastering knowledge objectives. The blogs, again, did well. The bookmarks of resources that they found and were sharing with each other. So we're trying to do this in different environments. And again, I've had a little bit of trouble changing the system in our undergraduate program. It's much more, I don't know, calcified, I call it, but it's kind of, they know how to do it in one kind of a model, and it's hard to get interventions. But I think that's what the challenge that we have. And also, of course, we have to publish results, trials in different contexts. This is all in the future. The ELGG system is being used such that if I post a blog message in one ELGG, it'll be transported to another, and it's quite nice for developing a community of the people who are using this open source software. And then, again, I'm going to have to talk about our current problems with the adoption of innovation. Is always, I think, a major hurdle. And we'll get to theorizing, does this educational social software really meet all the hype that's around it these days? So, just to conclude, design-based is a methodology developed by educators for educators, developed from American pragmatism, and there's been theme issues in the last 2 or 3, 4 years. Major educational researcher, widely read in the States anyways, educational psychologist, and I've made a small bibliography of some of the current articles, and I also wrote an article on design-based research that ended up winning a Canadian award, so got to read that one. So I'm just going to end by how do we build this research culture. I think we need better dissemination with combined researcher, practitioner communities, better tools, and more funding and less fighting. This is a joke. I don't know if you guys get these every day, but you can see the pointy-haired boss. He asks Wally, the consummate shirker, he says, I want you to go help Alice. And so his help is to say, why don't you try to work harder? But he's worried that she's going to become dependent on him for that advice. This is not the kind of help I think we need to give to fellow researchers around the world. So online journals, a little plug for my own. If you're looking for an outlet, we did publish a couple of months ago a study from your institution on tutor support, and we're always looking for quality articles. It's open access, no charge, so you feel free to subscribe. And this is, as Jorm mentioned, we have a number of social software tools built in to this site to support Canadian distance education researchers. We do allow others to join. They become honorary Canadians as soon as they fill out the profile here, so if you're interested, please join. And just to end with how to disseminate, these are 3 books. This one I wrote with Randy Garrison, E-Learning for the 21st Century. It sells on Amazon for $135. I mean, nobody's going to buy it for $135. But it got translated into Arabic, and it's for sale for $8. And I thought, and it turned out that somebody showed me this little symbol here is the House of Saud, and that's the reason, I guess, they subsidized it. This book, again, is typical educational kind of 934 copies sold at $52. I mean, you can still buy it. Do please buy it. But this one, The Theory and Practice of Online Learning, this was 2 months ago. It had 72,000 downloads, plus individual chapters. It's been translated into 4 other languages. I mean, if you let the stuff free and get it out there, and the return for me personally has been so much greater on none of these books have I ever made more than about $1,000 a piece on. Mind you, I haven't made $1,000 on this one yet, but I've gotten a lot more value out of it professionally. So give your stuff away and get the benefits from it. So, concluding, distance education is grossly under-resourced to meet the magnitude of the opportunity and the demand. It's fun to pick fun at other people's methods, as I was just demonstrating, but it's not very productive. I think we really need more research of all types. But design-based research offers a promising new research design model. And I'm thinking that Web 2.0 enhanced interaction may offer keys to more effective knowledge growth and exchange. And I'll be talking about that more on Wednesday. So to conclude with famous German distance education scholar Otto Peters, he says that wisdom is fed equally from practical, theoretical, and ethical knowledge, and from a large quality of reflected experience. So, thank you very much. Your comments.